This week on the Noir Factory, we're trying something a little different. We're presenting a case with no commercial interruptions. Think of this as an experiment because really, we kind of need those commercial interruptions. But what we can do is be a little bit more creative in our placement if we need to. Really, it's up to you. Let us know what you feel about it by giving us a shout on Facebook or Twitter, or even at Seamus at thenoirfactory.com. Let us know how you feel you would like us to proceed, or even if it doesn't matter at all, and we'll do our best to accommodate. So far, we've gotten some feedback on this, but we could use more. And in reality, this is a one-man show, and commercials help keep the lights on. No matter how this experiment works out, however, we stand by our pledge to keep any commercial sponsorship or whatever in the vein of our casework. We promise to only bring you things that you're excited about, that add to the cases at hand rather than take away from the experience. So if you have an opinion, or even if you think there's some partnership we have to consider, or even if you just don't care about it, give us a yell and we'll look into it. Now on to this week's crime, not yet in progress. There are tall tales, and then there are barroom tales. These are the stories you tell in dark, dingy dives, the kind of places where the odor of cheap cigarettes and despair float through the air. Leave the bowl of peanuts alone. You don't want to know how long they've been sitting there. And ask the bartender for a glass of the good stuff. You know, the bottle under the bar that's covered in dust. Grab a seat and make sure to sip rather than gulp. Case number 29, George Remus, King of the Bootleggers. Today on the Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
He and this Wolfsheim brought up a lot of side street drugstores here and in Chicago and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Great Gatsby. George Remus was born on November 13th, 1876 in Germany, to Frank and Maria Remus, a working-class family. He was a middle child with an older sister and younger brother, and while he was still just a toddler, the family immigrated to the U.S. The Remus family ended up in Baltimore, then moved to Cincinnati, and finally to Chicago, with an intense wave of German immigrants to the Midwest. Frank Remus found work as a lumber scorer during the boom time in Chicago, and his son George flourished in school. Picking up languages quickly, he was fluent in both German and English at an early age, and carried with him only the slightest German accent. When George was only 14, his father, Frank, who'd suffered from acute rheumatism, was left disabled by the disease and unable to work. That left George to take up the mantle as the breadwinner of the family. With fierce determination, he told his dad not to worry, and he dedicated himself to not only supporting his family, but to help him rise through society as well. He went to work at his uncle's pharmacy as a clerk, and at the age of 19 passed the state exam for a pharmacist license. He continued to save and invest, and within 2 years of becoming a pharmacist, he purchased his uncle's shop, and a few years after that opened a second, all the while dabbling in selling health insurance on the side. As a young adult, Remus grew to be a fastidious man who was meticulous about his clothes and his surroundings. He prided himself on being a connoisseur of great food, fine wine, art, and literature. He considered himself a man's man, even though he grew into a soft, pudgy adult. He could still count on that iron will of his to achieve any goal he set for himself. He was quick with his fists, and even though he wasn't the most athletic man, he could wear down almost any opponent. He also took up swimming with the same amount of focus and determination that he did everything. He became a member of the Illinois Athletic Club, and he joined their water polo team, participating in national events. In 1907, he set the record for endurance swimming in Lake Michigan by swimming for 5 hours and 40 minutes in the dead of winter. And that was a record that held up for decades. In 1899, he fell in love with one of his customers, Lillian Kauf, and in July of that year, the two were married. The following year, George Remus's daughter, Romola, was born. When Romola was only 8 years old, she was cast by L. Frank Baum himself to play Dorothy Gale in the first film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. Before George Remus was 30 years old, he'd met every goal society, or more importantly, he himself had ever set. But the arena, that of a pharmacist and a business owner, wasn't the one he had chosen. He'd been thrust into it. Now it was time for George Remus to face bigger challenges. In 1900, George Remus began to study law. He attended law school at night, and he completed a 3-year course in only 18 months. Predictably, he passed the bar exam on his first attempt, and he was admitted to the Illinois bar. He opened up a private practice in the famous Ashland Block building in Chicago, the building that housed the great Clarence Darrow. Remus established himself as a criminal defense attorney, and he brought his considerable experience and determination to this endeavor as well. And almost right out of the gate, things went bad for him. He liked to represent the challenging and the newsworthy, the kinds of clients that went to court and allowed him to make a grand argument. The problem with that was that most of these clients were as guilty as sin, and a large percentage of them were found guilty and executed. In 1914, Remus took the case of William Cheney Ellis, a local merchant who had been charged with the killing of his wife in Chicago's Sherman House Hotel. The case was lurid and sensational, and the press was all over it. And again, Remus's client was as guilty as sin. Still, Remus looked forward to the making of the argument and the press that came with it, so he decided to get creative. He was always a voracious reader, and he kept up with academic journals. With every reporter in Chicago watching, Remus introduced the unheard of transitory insanity defense. Remus explained to the jury that Ellis had repeatedly stabbed his wife in a jealous rage. Then, due to exhaustion, he lost consciousness and passed out. When he awoke, according to Remus, he had no idea of what he had done. The trial lasted for more than 3 weeks, and Remus held the jury in the palm of his hands, despite their doubts in this transitory insanity. In the end, Ellis was still found guilty, but the case had a minor win for Remus. Ellis was sentenced to 15 years instead of death, and more importantly, at least for Remus, his picture was plastered on every front page in Chicago. On paper, George Remus's star continued to rise, but in his personal life it was a different matter. He began to see Augusta Imogen Holmes, a young woman who worked in a nearby deli and was recently divorced. He set Imogen up in an apartment of her own and began spending more time with her than with his wife and daughter. In a very public proceeding, which seemed to be the way the Remuses like to do things, the divorce was settled in 1919. A year later, Imogen and George were married, and George adopted Imogen's 13-year-old daughter, Ruth. In the courtroom, Remus started to see a change in the clients he took. With the passing of the Volstead Act, more and more of his clients were bootleggers, working-class guys who made money off of illegal production and sales of alcohol. Remus still enjoyed the spectacle of the courtroom argument, and his defense often lasted days. Representing clients on bootlegging charges often brought him in front of Judge Kenshaw Mountain Landis, the man who would go on to be the first commissioner of Major League Baseball. Landis did not enjoy spectacle and would often arbitrarily stop a case and fine defendants, usually in the excess of $10,000, much to Remus's dismay. To his amazement, his clients often paid in cash right there in open court. Watching these events unfold, Remus took an even keener interest in the Prohibition law and even memorized the Volstead Act word for word. And like everything George Remus attempted, he didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to be the best. His goal was to control all the alcohol produced and sold in the United States. And even though that goal was lofty, unrealistic, and completely unattainable, that was the bar George Remus had always set for himself. He wanted to set up a legal enterprise and trade his company on Wall Street. And while he wasn't a drinker himself, early on he realized the folly of trying to execute a law like Prohibition and searched for legal loopholes in it. Now, before the passage of the Volstead Act, the U.S. was filled with distilleries and breweries containing millions of gallons of beer and thousands of gallons of spirits. Using these legal loopholes, Remus was able to purchase these pre-existing, already taxed property that was the alcohol, and he could corner the market without violating the letter of the law, at least according to his interpretation of Title II, Section 3 of the Volstead Act. His interpretation of Title II, Section 6 of the Volstead Act, Remus found that it was legal to supply medical facilities with medicinal alcohol, as well as established a medical warehouse to sell those outlets. Section 6 also stipulated that alcohol could be transported if you had permits issued by the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue. Remus placed all these components together into what he called the Circle, and he set himself up as the premier bootlegger in the United States. Or as he referred to himself, usually in the third person, he was George Remus, king of the bootleggers. While there were problems and legal challenges right off the bat, Remus made money from his system. More money than he could have ever imagined. In an added wrinkle, Remus found that he could make even more money from his circle if he arranged for the alcohol being transported to be hijacked and then sold on the black market. He set up shop in Chicago, but organized crime already had a hold of the town. So he found that trying to sell alcohol out in the open, he had to deal with public officials, and he was without public clout. After a few skirmishes with both sides of the law, he moved his operations to Cincinnati, and from there, operations grew. Remus sold his alcohol in out-of-the-way places in the Midwest, as well as the big cities. At the same time, he continued to buy up distilleries and breweries and continued to seek out new outlets for sales. And he was very successful at all of these things. Cincinnati was home to a large German-American population, and Remus quickly became a pillar of the community. Working with lawyers and local officials, he purchased even more wholesale drug companies as distribution channels and created a trucking company, the American Transportation Company, to move his alcohol. He bought up an area of land away from the city in a hard, barren stretch of real estate. The area, which was known as Death Valley, had a single road in and out. The road was manned by armed guards, and from Death Valley, Remus was able to supply 8 states with whiskey at sky-high prices. In Washington, D.C., Remus's representative, Elijah Zoline, spread his influence and Remus's cash around enough to purchase influence there. George Remus was on the government's radar, but for some reason, they never acted on it. Remus was now wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, and he felt as if he couldn't be touched by either the mob or the government. And for a while, that was exactly how it was. He and Imogen had built a mansion in Cincinnati neighborhood of Price Hill, and he nicknamed the mansion the Marble Palace. The grounds of the home were immaculate, and his wife's fondness for the pools led Remus to construct an elaborate pool he called the Imogen Baths. In his personal life, George Remus was outgoing, cheerful, and generous to a fault. He gave lavishly to charities and civic groups, partly because of the goodwill it brought him, but also because he'd hoped to buy his family into society. He threw parties that became legendary. In one New Year's Eve party, he had a 15-piece orchestra play partygoers into the dawn as they sipped champagne, and he rewarded each guest with truly memorable party favors. Diamond stick pins for the men, brand new Pontiacs for the women. There was even a legend that said George Remus met a young F. Scott Fitzgerald in the bar at the C.O. Bach Hotel in Chicago. While this may or may not be true, the exploits of Remus's public life colored the description that Fitzgerald eventually gave to Jay Gatsby. Life seemed so good for George Remus that the brilliant bootlegger did the one thing he'd never done in his entire life. He took his eye off the prize. In Cincinnati, Remus began to get permits to sell alcohol from distilleries he didn't yet own. He purchased breweries and distilleries at a dizzying pace. By 1922, most of the liquor in the Midwest or the East came from George Remus, and his bootlegging empire grew to over $6 million in 1920s dollars. And George Remus ruled the whole thing from downtown Cincinnati. On October 23, 1925, Authorities raided the Death Valley farm, and over $35,000 worth of alcohol was found. George Remus was brought up on 3,000 counts of the Volstead Act violation. In court, Remus was only charged with violating 5 counts of prohibition law. In court, he turned loose his bastion of high-priced lawyers upon the newly appointed U.S. Assistant Attorney General, Mabel Walker Wildebrandt. She was more than ready for them. George Remus was given the maximum 2-year sentence, as well as disbarred from the Illinois bar, a sentence he fought all the way to the Supreme Court. As his choices started to leave him, he did his best to arrange for his prison stay. He gave his wife, Imogene, power of attorney over his house, the distilleries, the permits, the entire $50 million Remus empire. He told her to keep an eye on business and make sure everything ran smoothly. If she had any questions, she could visit him in prison and he would offer his counsel. It turned out that Imogene had very few questions. While Remus was in prison, he cooperated with the authorities, and he told them how he was able to use loopholes in the Volstead Act to his advantage. One of the authorities who investigated him in prison was Prohibition agent Franklin Dodge. Dodge was able to learn much of Remus's operation, but the key pieces of information for him was the fact that Remus's wife Imogene held the power of attorney. Remus served his sentence and on release found that Dodge had resigned from public work and had begun an affair with his wife Imogene. He and Imogene had broken Remus's empire into pieces, and they'd sold it. In fact, the moment he left prison, he was served with divorce papers. When he went home to the Marble Palace, he found the windows boarded up and the interior stripped down to the studs. It was said that George Remus dropped to his knees and started to cry. Consumed with rage, he fought the divorce proceedings at every avenue. He asked for continuances and changes of venue, and he countered soon Imogene. His mechanisms finally came to a head on October 6th of 1927. Remus had learned that his wife and stepdaughter were staying at the Elms Hotel, and he arranged for a car to wait outside with him in it. When Imogene and her daughter drove to the courthouse for the proceedings, Remus's driver followed them. He ran them off the road at the Spring House Gazebo, a popular community setting. When Imogene emerged from the car, Remus leapt from his vehicle with a gun and he gave chase. He caught Imogene in the middle of the park and shot her twice in the abdomen, killing her in front of a park full of witnesses, including her daughter Ruth. When Imogene was pronounced dead, George Remus gave himself up to the authorities, telling reporters he felt nothing but regret that Franklin Dodge wasn't with her. In court, George Remus, penniless, but still possessing the brilliant legal mind he always had, opted to represent himself. In what was the trial of the century, Remus was charged with first-degree murder. In his opening statements, Remus put forward the defense that he had pioneered himself years earlier for William Cheney Ellis. He claimed he suffered from transitory insanity. The case, which drug out for 6 weeks, captivated the country and played out on the front pages of every newspaper in America. The prosecutor was Charles P. Taft, the son of former President of the United States and current Supreme Court judge. He called 3 alienists to stand and prove that George Remus was indeed sane at the time of the murder. George Remus countered that by calling Clarence Darrow as a character witness. Witnesses were called for the prosecution to describe Remus's ice-cold demeanor during the murder, and other witnesses for the defense described Remus's diminished capacity after learning of his wife's infidelity. In the end, it came down to closing arguments, and that's where George Remus shined. He held the jury in the palm of his hand, and he described the 2 George Remuses. The one that stood before them, arguing the cold facts of the case. The other, the empty chair in the court, feared for his life. It was said that several jurors wiped away tears during his argument, and in the end, to absolutely no one's surprise, the jury took 19 minutes to return a verdict. He was found not guilty by reasons of transitory insanity. Remus spent 2 months at the Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane before he was found competent to return to society. When he was released, he tried to pick up where he left off as the king of the bootleggers, but he found in his short time away that the criminal world had changed. Organized crime now ruled illegal alcohol, and there was no room left for a king. No longer being able to practice law, Remus tried his best to make a place for himself in society. He spent his remaining years practicing real estate and trying, in vain, to regain his lost empire. He settled in Covington, Kentucky, across the river from Cincinnati, and he passed away on December 20th, 1952, at age 77 of natural causes. But his name lives on today in George Remus, a smooth as velvet, small batch bourbon. Try some today and tell him we said hi.
That closes the books on this case. Join us next time on the wrong side of the tracks at the Noir Factory, as we look at the best in true crime, noir, and hard-boiled stories has to offer. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please subscribe on iTunes and leave an honest review. And be sure to stop by the website to fill up on pulpy and hard-boiled goodness. And remember, nice guys finish last.
Psst, still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
16, 23, 20, 6, 52, 21. That is all. For the key to this message, visit thenoirfactory.com/key. That's thenoirfactory.com/key. Good night.